All right, looks like we're good. All right, so remind me, and I will look here in the modules section as I'd asked the uh, other web dev class this yesterday because I couldn't remember what all we had talked about because we have not seen each other in a while. Is that correct? The last time we saw each other was a week, 2 weeks ago, I think, or a week ago.
Week ago. Last week it was a Thursday, so I don't know.
But anyway, so yeah, it's been a while. Did we watch all three parts of the how to create a game using JavaScript? Or did we watch at least two of those?
Pretty sure we watched the first two. I'm not sure.
The first two. The first two. Okay. Okay. So I've got those under the modules for week 4. Those all three of those videos. I also have a couple other videos under there that I'm going to actually move down into this week. One of which we're going to watch in class today. What I would like is by the end of the week, so by Thursday, if possible, get that game done, if you would please. Now, I mentioned in the class yesterday, in Web Dev 1 yesterday, that I'm a big proponent of repetition. Okay, and I say this to say the video that we're going to. Do you remember the video that we watched in C# 1 yesterday? How the guy was kind of flying through stuff, right? He sort of does. This is a different guy, but he sort of does the same thing in this video. This guy does, where he's moving pretty fast. Now, I would advise you to go ahead and boot up Brackets or whatever web editor you prefer, and go ahead and make you an HTML file, just index.html, style.css, and script.js. Okay. So just, and you can just, you don't even have to save them in a folder right now. You can just save them all on the desktop or whatever. I also, within that HTML file, go ahead and if your text editor of choice allows you to quick create an HTML file, go ahead and do that. Otherwise, HTML shell htmlshell.com will allow you to grab the necessary boilerplate code, and then you'll just be able to follow along. Now, you might get just a little bit behind because, like I said, he does move fairly fast, but in the lab portion today, we're going to be working on, if you didn't get the game done, you'll be working on that. But if you have that done already, you'll be working on making what he's making. So if you're following along, when we get to the lab portion, if you're an adult student, congratulations, you get to go home. Because you already have it done. Otherwise, I'll have the video up on YouTube, or up on Canvas, excuse me, for you to watch and get all caught up. Now, he does not use any external assets. Everything is created purely in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And one other thing before we load the video up and get started, I want to mention that I'm going to ask you to change some things, as I always do. Change the color of the buttons. It's a calculator that we're making. Change the color of the buttons, change the background, change the font you use. Maybe you want to use like an old-timey calculator font or something like that instead of that like sans serif font that he uses. So I encourage you to make those changes as you go. Okay. So it maybe load up a website that has a list of colors, right? You can just copy the color codes or something like that. Okay, so everybody got it? Something semi-loaded up, at least loaded up to the point that we're ready to go? Okay, cool. Like I said, follow along to the best of your abilities. If you get a little lost or get a little behind, please don't panic. You will have a week to get this. I mean, it'll be next Tuesday before you need to have this calculator done. So you've got 7 days to knock it out. Okay, so without further ado, let's hop over here and watch this build a calculator with JavaScript tutorial. Now, it's a fairly lengthy video. It's going to take up the duration, the majority of the lecture, but I will, especially this is especially the case because I will pause periodically to provide commentary, as I often do, and talk about stuff. So, All right, let's hop over here and check this video out.
Hello everybody, welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. In today's video, we're going to take a look at making this simple calculator using plain vanilla JavaScript and modern ES6 practices. Let's get started now. To get started, let's look at the basic functionality of our calculator. We can add numbers just like this, and if we want to, we can multiply numbers. Any of that stuff works. The delete key will just remove one character from our list here. All clear will get rid of everything, and of course we have the ability to use decimal numbers as well for our addition, multiplication, subtraction, and so on. We also have the ability to chain operations, so we can say 1 times 36 and just click times again and it'll automatically put it up here, and we can do another multiplication and so on. So let's get started coding this. Over here I have Visual Studio Code open, and all we need to do is create some files. First, we want an index.html, which is going to be all of our HTML. We'll create a styles.css for all of our styles, and a script.js, which is going to contain all of our JavaScript. Next, we want to go into our index.html file here, use exclamation point and hit enter to get our boilerplate HTML code. Here we can just put calculator as the title, and we want to import our script tag and our style sheet. So to do that, we'll just add a link here for our style sheet, and we can just say our href is going to be styles.css, and we need to tell the browser that this is a style sheet here. Perfect. And then we can do our same thing for our script tag. The source here is going to be equal to script.js, and we want to make sure we defer that so it loads after our entire page is parsed. Now that that's out of the way, we can save this here, and we can open this up using live server. That way we can have our page open right here with nothing on it, of course. The first thing we want to do is actually add in all the different elements for our calculator. And we're going to use grid to lay everything out nice and neat. So what we want to do is we want to have a single div, which is going to wrap everything. And we're just going to give it a class here, which is going to say calculator grid. Make sure that's lowercase. And inside of here, we're going to put our different elements. We're going to have the screen, as well as all of our different buttons inside of our application. So the first thing we want is our output screen. So we'll say, inside of here, we have a div, which is just going to have a class of output, so that we know this is our output. And inside of here, we're going to have two divs, because as you can see, when we add something, multiply it or divide it, it goes up here in this smaller div, and the other numbers show up here in this bottom div. So we're going to have a first div, which is just going to be here with a class that's just going to have the class of previous operand. And the reason we're calling it this is because this is whatever is up here, whatever we typed in previously. And we're going to have a second div, which is going to look just like this, but it's going to be our current operand, so whatever we are currently typing down here. Then after this output div, we have all of our different buttons that we want to create. So for example, we have a button here, and we want this button to have the text AC for all clear. And we also want to add a class to this button, because as you can see, this button is twice as large as all the other buttons. So we're just going to add a class here, which is going to say span2. And this, instead of our CSS, will make sure it takes up the space of 2 buttons. Now let's copy that down, do the same thing for delete, and in this case, we don't need this span anymore. Copy it down again, and we can do delete here. And the easiest way to do delete is to just copy the symbol that we have from our application. You can also Google to copy the symbol and just paste it in here. And now we don't have to do any special code to go on to the next row because we're using grid. So again, we can just copy this down, change it to 1, 2, 3, and so on. We're going to have multiplication here. And we're just going to do this till we get all the way down to our equals button.
I'm going to pause here real quick to give you a chance to catch up here. So you've got your delete, divide. For now, just maybe put a slash, like a forward slash or something, since that's the symbol used for divide, so you don't have to get the character map open or get online to get that division symbol. We can worry about that later. But yeah, go ahead. So you have 1, 2, 3, asterisk for multiplication, 4, 5, 6 plus for addition, 7, 8, 9 dash for minus, and then on the bottom row you have period, 0, and the equal sign. Okay? You can just copy and paste all those buttons straight in. Alrighty.
And now that we're all the way down to the equals button, again you want to make sure you add that class here, which is just going to say span 2, since this equals button also takes up 2 rows, just like the all clear button does. And now that we have all of that done, that's essentially all of the HTML we need for our application. If we go into our application over here, you can see that we have all of our different buttons being shown up, but clearly there's no styles being applied to them. So let's jump into our styles.css and start styling our calculator to look just like this. The first thing that I like to do is select all of our elements, including our before elements and our after elements, just like this. And I want to change the box sizing to be border box so that way it's easier to size our elements. Also, I want to set our font family here so that it's set on all of our different elements. In this case, I'm going to use a font called Gotham Rounded, which you may not have installed on your system, so you can choose any font that you like the look of. And we want to apply a default font to fall back onto, so in our case we'll default to sans serif as Gotham Rounded is not found. Next, we want to set the font weight for our entire application, and in our case we're just going to use a font weight of normal. Now that we have that done and out of the way, we go over here, we can see already our font has changed slightly to be this Gotham Rounded font. Next thing we want to do is actually set up our background because that's going to be fairly straightforward. The next thing we want to do is style our background. In our case, we're just going to select the body element, and we're going to first remove all padding and margin so that our background fills our entire screen. And then we're going to apply a background here. So we'll use the background keyword, and we want to apply a linear gradient. We want to apply this gradient to the right, so that way our first color is going to be the color on the left, and our second color is the color on the right. So we just want to define our two colors here. In our case, we're using 00AAFF as our left side color, and our right side color is just going to be a green color, which is 00FF6C. Now, if we save that and go back to our page over here, you see that we have our gradient going all the way across, which is perfect. The next thing we want to do is style this grid that we have right here. So we can just go down here and select that calculator grid class that we defined earlier, which is wrapping all of our different buttons and elements. We want to make sure that our display here is set to grid, and we want to justify the content into the center of the screen, and we want to align the items into the center of the screen. That way everything is centered, and if we save that and look back, you can see that everything is centered, but it's not centered vertically, and that's because our calculator grid doesn't take up the full height. So we want to set a height on here, a minimum height, which is just going to be 100 view H, which is just essentially saying it's going to fill 100% of the height all the time. Now if we say that, you see that everything is centered in the very center of our screen and spaced out. In order to make our buttons actually look like our buttons over here though, we want to use grid template columns and grid template rows. So first we can define our columns, and in our case our columns are going to repeat. We're going to have 4 columns, and our columns are all going to be 100 pixels wide. Next we want to do the same thing but for our template rows. So we're going to have our rows here, and our first row, this output, can grow as large as it needs. If we input a very large number in here, for example, you can see that this grows to fit that large number. So we want to have first a value which is going to be a min-max value, which says at minimum we want this to be 120 pixels tall, but at a maximum we want it to be auto, which essentially says as large as it needs to be to fit everything. Then after that we want to repeat 5 times the value of 100 pixels because we want our buttons down here to be exactly square, and as you can see we have 5 different rows of buttons. Now if we save that and go back to our view over here, you can see that everything is starting to get laid out how we like it. In order to properly position our buttons, the first thing we want to do is actually select them. So we can just do that by selecting all the buttons inside of the grid, and all we want to do is change our cursor to be the pointer cursor so that when we hover over them we get a nice pointer, so as you can see here. And next we want to change the font size so that it's quite a bit larger and easier to see. We'll use 2 rem. We want to give it a little bit of a border. In this case we're just going to use a 1 pixel solid white border around all of our elements. And if we look over here we can see that we have that 1 pixel border around everything. We want to remove the outline from these buttons. This is just something that browsers put in by default and we don't actually need. And lastly we want to apply a background color to these different elements. In our case we're just going to apply a slightly opaque background of completely white, so 255, 255, 255, but it's only going to be 75% opaque. Now if we save that and go back, you see our buttons are already starting to look like the buttons over here. Last thing we need to do to these buttons is actually make it so that when we hover over them, they change color. Because as you can see over here, these buttons change to be almost completely white when you hover. So in order to do that, we'll again copy this selector down, but we'll use the hover portion of it, and we want to just change the background color. It's going to stay the exact same white, but we'll change the opacity here to be 90%, And now if we go back over and hover over a button, you see that it turns to this white color. Now in order to fix our buttons so that they don't look quite so strange, we just need to change align items to align content because we want to align the entire content of this grid in the center and not the items themselves. Now if you save that, you see that our buttons are filling out the space that they need to. But you'll notice that this all clear button is not taking up 2 width spots, and this equals button is also not taking up 2 widths. So in order to fix that, we can just use that class, which is span2, and all we need to do is say that we want our grid column here to span 2 columns. And if we say that, you see automatically all clear and equal are now spanning 2 columns. But our output, which is this singular section right here, is not properly styled, so let's work on styling that next. In order to make it easier to see what we're styling, I'm going to add a little bit of dummy text in here. So we're going to say 123 plus, and down here we'll have 456. That way we have a little bit of dummy text we can play around with when we're doing our styles. So the first thing we want to do is style our actual output element as a whole. This, as we remember, is this blackish looking section right here. So in order to make it span the entire width, we have a really nice trick which is called grid column again, but in this case we want to say we want to go from column number 1 all the way to column number -1, which is essentially just the last column. And if we save that and go back here, you can see this now fills the entire width of our top row. Next thing we want to do is change the background color here. So we can change our background color to be RGBA again, and we want this to be black this time, and with that same 75% transparency. And already you can see this is starting to look a lot like our calculator over here. Next, we want to align these elements inside of our container, and the easiest way to do that is going to be using flex. So we'll change our display here to flex. We'll align our items on flex end because we want these to be on the right side of our container over here. And we also want them to be spaced out as far apart from each other, so we're just going to use justify content, and we want to say space between. This is going to put as much space between our elements as possible. Now we can save that, and you can see that our elements are being lined up side by side instead of vertically, so we want to change our flex direction. To do that, we can just say flex direction column so that they line up vertically instead of horizontally. Also, you'll notice everything is pushed up right to the edges of our container, so to change that, we'll just add a little bit of padding to our container, for example, 10 pixels. Now as you can see, everything is not being pushed up to the edges of the container, and also I'm going to change this space between to say space around instead, because it'll push our elements a little bit closer to each other and a little further away from the top and bottom of the container. The last thing we want to do is, as you remember over here, things wrap as they get too long, so in order to make that happen, we need to use what's called word wrap, which is going to allow us to say where we want to break our words. So we can say we want to be able to break a word in the middle of it, so not just at the end of a word or during a space. And we also want to put word break here to say that we want to be able to break all words. Now, if 456 became too long, for example, it would just wrap to the next line, as it does over here. Last thing we need to do is style our 2 different text elements that we have. So in order to select those, we can first say inside of our output element, we want to get the previous operand, and we want to change the color of this to be a mostly white color. So we'll say RGBA, 255, 255, 255, and again 75% opacity, so it comes across as a little bit of a gray color, and we want the font size here to be 1.5 REM. If you save that, you see that it gives us a nice slight gray color, which is a little bit smaller than what this text will be when we're done. So we can essentially copy this, paste it down, and instead of previous, we have our current operand. Our color here is going to be purely white instead of partially white, and our font size is going to be 2.5 REM. Now if you save that, you see the styles for our entire calculator are essentially done, and they work almost exactly the same as over here. Now that all that's done, we can finally get to the interesting part, which is coding up the JavaScript, which will allow our calculator to actually work when we click the buttons. To make this easier, let's remove this placeholder text that we added when we did the style sheets, and let's open up our JavaScript right here and start working. Now the first thing that we want to do is select all of our different numbers, all of our different operands over here, our operations, as well as our clear button, delete button, and all the other miscellaneous buttons. But in order to make that easy to do, we want to just put some classes into our HTML that'll be easy to select by. And since I don't want to mix our styling classes with our JavaScript, let's use data attributes instead of classes. So we can say data.
Okay, so this is something we haven't talked about yet. This is kind of, I mean, as he alluded to just now, this is sort of the JavaScript equivalent to classes, not classes like in an object-oriented programming language, but classes in the sense of this allows us to basically pull and push data. To say that these are number buttons. This is the equals button. These are the operands, the operators, like plus and minus and that sort of thing. Just do as he does. But I just wanted to warn you, or to give you a heads up. This is a concept that we have not discussed yet. This is our introduction to it.
Data operation. And essentially, we can select this data attribute in our JavaScript to say we want to select all the data operation buttons. So let's copy this down to all of our different operations, plus and minus. There we go. We can do the same exact thing for numbers. So we'll say data number, and we're going to copy this down to all of the different numbers we have. And the reason, again, why I'm using data attributes instead of classes is because it's easier to see what parts of the HTML are being used by JavaScript and which parts are being used by the actual CSS. And again, I put the number class here on the period because the period acts just like a number for the focus of our calculator. Next, we want to do one for our equals button. So we'll just say data equals. We're going to have one for delete, data delete, and lastly our all clear. So data all clear. And we also need to add these to our previous operand and current operand. And again, I don't want to use these classes since they're already used by our CSS. So we'll just put a data previous operand and again a data current operand down on this one. And that should be all the changes we need to make to our HTML to be able to select these elements in our JavaScript. Now inside of here, let's first get some constant variables, which are going to be all of our different buttons. So we have our number buttons, and we can just query that by saying document.query selector all, which is going to get us all elements that match a certain string. And in our case, we select a data attribute, which must be inside of brackets. And we say we want to select data number. This is going to get all of our number elements. We can do the same exact thing, but for our operation buttons. And this is just going to say data operation. And of course, we want to get our smaller buttons as well. So we can dial down here and we can say we want to get our equals button. This is just going to be a single button. So instead of doing document.query selector all, we're going to use just query selector, which will get a single element for us instead of multiple. Again, we can say data equals, close off that square bracket. And we want to do this a bunch of other times. We want to do it for the delete button that we have. We want to do it for all clear button. And of course, we need to get our previous operand. And this is not a button, this is actually a text element. And we want to do the same thing, but for our current operand. And we need to go over here. This is data equals, data delete, all clear. And this is going to be the previous operand. And lastly, the current operand. Now that we have everything selected, let's actually...
Okay, so he's getting ready here in just a minute to start doing some methods and that sort of thing with JavaScript. Just as a reminder, as with C#, while you are not free to just do whatever you want and throw things wherever you wish, you have almost absolute freedom to put things where you wish in your JavaScript document. You'll see what I mean as he goes, but sort of like in C#, how in Python you have to say, I'm going to declare the variable here, I'm going to use the variable here. If it's global, I'm putting global in front of its name to make it a global and things like that. It's not really that way in JavaScript, just like it isn't in C#. You're declaring all of your constants, all of your variables up here, right? Quick question, why const and not var? Does anybody remember what const means? Any thoughts as to what it might mean?
Constant.
Yeah. Okay, so give me an example of another constant that you might use, like just something that might be a common example of a constant, like in an application. Maybe pi, right? Pi. Now, why would you want to make pi a constant? By which I mean, what is the purpose of a constant? Why would you want to do that instead of just making it a var? Think about what it's called. Any thoughts? Come on.
So, like, would the variable be like Would it be harder to change than like a var?
It's impossible to change.
Okay.
You can't change the value of a constant. That's why it's called a constant. You would, with a var, it's a variable, so its value can vary, right? With a const, there's never going to be a situation where and the people in the live stream can't see this, but I'm doing the quotation marks, where the value of any of these buttons are going to change, right? Like these will always be the number buttons. These will always be the operation, well, and the period too. These will always be the operation buttons. This will always be the all clear button. This will always be the right. And so you could, I guess, if you wanted, make them vars.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was just confused because unless you purposely change them, they're not just going to change.
Correct. That is correct. So that brings us to what we call best practices.
Yeah.
Which is the idea that there is not necessarily a right or wrong way to do something in this regard, but there is a good and a better way to do it, right? It's slipping my mind at the moment. There's something else in this video I'm going to mention that about best practices too. Actually, no, that was yesterday in C#, wasn't it? That I talked about best practices, I think. I don't. Was that C#? Yes. Okay. Yeah. So that. Oh yes, I remember. It was with lists or something. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I remember that now. But yeah. So this is a best practices thing. You should get into the habit of, if something is not going to vary and thus would not be a variable, that you should make it a constant instead. That's sort of the idea there, is why he's doing that. So okay. I feel like I rambled on that for too much, but let's move on.
Actually think about how we're going to create the JavaScript that'll make our calculator work as it does over here. The first thing that we need to think about is how are we going to store all the information for what's number currently typed here, what number is currently typed here, what operation is it, and I think the easiest way to do that is to use a class, so we're going to create a calculator class. I like to do these at the top of the file if possible, so let's just go in here and create a class which is going to be called a calculator. And inside of this class we're going to put a constructor which is going to take all of the inputs for it, as well as all the functions for our calculator. So our constructor is essentially just going to take our previous operand text element and our current operand text element. And this is because we need to know where to place our display text for our calculator. So we can just say previous operand text element and current, and inside of here we can set some variables for this class. So we can just set these just like this, and we could do the exact same thing for the current text element. And this essentially gives us a way to set these text elements inside of our calculator class. Next, we want to think.
Let's pause there real quick, give you a second to get caught up. In yesterday's class, which is also Web Dev 2, I did not pause to discuss any of these things or pause to let people get caught up because nobody was even trying to do it. So I did not slow down or pause to give them the opportunity to get caught up. All right, I'm gonna start moving on again. I just wanted to give you just a moment to get caught up. Pro tip: take advantage of Control-C for copy and Control-V for paste to copy and paste. Like for example, in this right here, the only word you're changing is you're changing the word previous to the word current. In both these locations, you may as well just copy the whole line and just change that one word instead of retyping the whole thing.
Think about all the operations our calculator class can perform. We have the clearing function, the delete function, the adding of a number. Also, we have the equals function and the adding of an operation. So let's define some of these functions. The first one we mentioned is clear, and this is just going to clear out our different variables. Next, we're going to have our delete function for removing a single number. We're going to create a function called append number, which is essentially what's going to happen every single time a user clicks on a number to add to the screen. Just as you see over here, you click a number and it adds it to the screen. Next thing we need to do is to have a choose operation function. This is what's going to happen anytime a user clicks on one of these operations over here. And this function needs to take the particular operation that the user selected. And same thing with the number function, we need to actually pass the number the user selected. The last two functions that we need to have is we need to have a compute function, which is just going to take our values inside of our calculator and compute a single value for what we need to display on the calculator. And lastly, we need to have a function that allows us to update our display. So we'll just call this update display, and this is going to update the values inside of our output. And with these operations all defined, let's think about the different properties our calculator needs to store. We need to know the previous operand the user entered, the current operand that they're working on, and the operation that they've selected, if any. So inside of the clear function, all we need to do is remove all of these values. The first thing we can do is just say this dot current operand, which is just going to be what is defined by this number right here. We just want to default this to an empty string if they clear it. We want to do the same thing for the previous operand. Again, default it to an empty string. And lastly, we want to change the operation to be undefined, since they don't have any operation selected if we clear things. And as soon as we create our calculator, we want to call this function, this dot clear, and this is because we want to clear all of our inputs and set them all to the default values as soon as we create a new calculator. So now that we know all the different things that our calculator can do, defined by our functions, and all the different variables that it can hold, let's work on hooking up all of our different variables down here and making them operate on our calculator object. First thing we need to do is create a calculator. So we'll just create a calculator here. We're just going to set this equal to a new calculator, which is how you define classes. You say new followed by the class name, and then we pass everything from our constructor into it. In our case, we need to pass it the previous operand text and the current operand text element. Now that we've passed those elements in, we can actually use this calculator object. So to first use it, let's go with our number buttons. We're going to select our number buttons. We want to say for each, because we want to loop over all of these different buttons. And for each one of these buttons, we want to add an event listener. So we can say button.addEventListener, and this event listener is going to be whenever we click on the button, we want to do something. And in our case, all we want to do is we want to take our calculator and we want to add the number, so we'll say append number of whatever is inside that button. So we'll say button.enterText. And this is just going to be either 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., all the way down to the decimal point and the 0. And once that's done, we need to call calculator.updateDisplay. And this way, our display values up here will be constantly updated every time we click on a button down here. An easy way to test that everything we've written so far is working, if we scroll up, we can change our update display here to say this dot current operand text element dot inner text. So this will allow us to set the text of this value up here in the white. We can just set this equal to our this dot current operand, just like that. And inside of our append number, instead of actually appending the number, we can just change the current operand to equal that number. Now, if we go over to our calculator here and we click on a number, you'll see it shows up over here. And no matter what number we click on, it'll show up there. But if we click on an operation, for example, or any of these other buttons that aren't numbers, it won't do anything.
All right, I'm going to pause real quick and let you get caught up, if necessary, while I pose this question to you. On line 31, they have this dot current operand text element dot inner text. Thus far, we've used dot inner HTML, right? But we haven't really used dot inner text. For those of you who are in mobile app in next hour, this is going to, as the semester goes on, the difference in inner HTML and inner text is going to become very important. Now, let me ask you this. Does anyone want to wager a guess as to what the difference in the two is? I'm conflicted as to whether or not it's obvious or not. I feel like it's fairly obvious, but I could be incorrect. Does anybody want to wager a guess?
So does the dot inner HTML cover like the entire HTML and dot inner text?
Sure does.
Covers it?
Yep, correct. So with our mobile app, we're going to be testing if the inner text of something is equal to something, not its inner HTML. Inner HTML will be used in a situation like what we've used it for previously, which is to say we have HTML somewhere, and we're going to say the inner HTML of these two tags needs to be replaced with this. We don't just want to replace the inner text, because if we did that, we'd end up with all the styling tags and everything, and all the divs and whatever else we had, all the unordered lists and that kind of stuff, right? So make sure that if you're wanting to grab the value of what is in there, you're using inner text and not inner HTML. It's also important to when it comes to user input, that you want inner text and not inner HTML, because again, you want what they're typing in like the raw string form. Alrighty, let's move along.
So now we know that our appending number function is properly hooked up with all of our buttons, and our display is properly being updated every time we click on a button. And since we know that append number is working, we might as well actually write the append number function. So essentially all we need to do is we want to update this current operand value and append the number that we get passed to the end of it. So we can just say this dot current operand, we want to convert it to a string just in case it's a number. This way we can easily append something to the end by using plus, and we can just take our number here and convert it to a string as well. And the reason we need to convert everything to a string is because JavaScript will try to add these as actual numbers. It will try to do 1 plus 1 equals 2 instead of 1 plus 1 equals 11, because we want our numbers to be appended and not added. Now if we save that,
Sorry, I feel like I'm pausing a lot, but these are good conversations. So first thing I want to say, this is unrelated to this class, but anyone who's in Game Dev 1, that toString thing is important for what we're going to be doing Friday. Because gdevelop uses JavaScript for its programming, it's built in JavaScript, but also uses it to like modify the games themselves. So that toString thing is going to become important. So pay attention to that. But he mentioned a second ago 1 plus 1 equals 11. Okay, what does he actually mean by that? What kind of an operation is he referring to? Is he referring to addition or what?
Concatenation.
Concatenation, that's exactly right. That's also relevant to the Friday class as well, because what we'll be doing is we'll be converting the score that the user or the player has to a string, and we're going to concatenate score colon whatever their score is. That way the score will constantly update every single frame. So just wanted to throw that out there. I mentioned repetition earlier. That's why I constantly ask things like that, or indexes begin at 0, that sort of thing. Fun little fact for you, Caleb. We actually were talking in C#1 yesterday about how there are a few languages that are indexed at 1. Like Lua is one of them, Fortran's one. There's only like 6 or 8 of them that are like indexed at 1. Blew my mind. I had no idea. I was like, what? They're indexed at what? So anyway. All right, let's move on.
and we click on a number, you'll see that they constantly get added to the end of the list. But, for example, period keeps getting added, and we only want to allow our user to add one single period to this output section. So to check for that, we can just say if the number is equal to the period symbol, and we want to also check that we don't already have a period. So we can say that if this string of numbers here includes a period, just like this. So if we typed the period key and we already have a period key, we just want to return, which essentially will stop our function from executing any further, and we won't actually append that number. Now if we save that, and we go over here, and we try to add multiple periods, I'm clicking this, and all it does is add a single period, and no matter when we try to click that period key, it'll only allow us to add one. And this is the append number function completely done. With that out of the way, let's go down here, copy this, and do the exact same thing, but for our operation buttons. So we can change this to say operation buttons, and when we click on this, we want to, instead of append a number, we want to choose an operation, and again, we're just going to pass the text of that operation that we're choosing, and update the display here. Now, up in our choose operation function, we need to do a little bit of fancier math. If we look over here, clear out all of this, let's say we did 22, and as soon as we click an operation, you see that this gets brought into our previous operand value, and it clears out our current operand to be able to type in a new number. So let's actually implement that inside of our choose operation function. The first thing we need to do is set the operation, obviously, so we'll say this.operation is equal to the operation we passed in. That way our calculator knows what operation it needs to use when it computes the value. Then we want to set the previous operand equal to the current operand. We essentially are saying we're done typing the current number, so we recycle that over to this previous operand, and we want to clear out the new current operand. So we'll say that the current operand is just going to be equal to an empty string. We're essentially just clearing out that value. So now if we save that, go back to our calculator here, type some numbers, and we click plus, it'll completely clear our current operand, put it into the previous operand, and it'll allow us to type in a new value here. And the reason it's not being displayed is because in our update display, we're not actually setting that. So let's copy this down, and we'll say that the previous operand text element is going to be equal here to the previous operand. Now if we save that, type something out, and click plus, you see that that number gets moved up to the top section, which is great. We aren't appending the operation yet, but we will work on that later when we implement this update display function fully. You will notice, however, that if we click any of the operation buttons, it'll actually go through and do this even if we have no current value to operate on. So we need to make sure we add a check-in for that. We essentially just want to say that if the current operation, so the current operand, is empty, so it's empty string, just like that, we just want to return, which again will not let us execute any further into our code. Another thing to note about this choose operation function is if we look over here and we type in this value, we have a value here, we have a value up here, and we click an operation, it'll actually do the computation and it'll put all of our operand values where they need to be. So we need to have another check in here. This one is essentially saying that if the previous operand is not equal to an empty string, so if we already have something up here computed and something down here, we want to do the computation. So inside of here, we're just going to call the compute function, this.compute, and then do everything else as before. And this compute function will update all the variables as we need. So, for example, let's clear this out. This is our old example. If we say 55 plus 55, and if we click equals, it'll say 110. And again, if we say 55 plus 55, but we want to divide from that, for example, you see it does the computation for 110 and automatically prepends our operation here. And this is exactly what this little section of code is going to do as soon as we implement this.compute function. And with these two functions completed, we have all of the inner workings of how to set all the values inside of our calculator. All we need to do now is actually work on how we need to compute things as well as display things. So let's work on our computation first. To do this, we're going to take that equals button that we have, and we want to add an event listener to it. In this case, again, it's going to be a click event listener. It's going to pass in that button, and all this is going to do is come in here. It's going to call the compute function on our calculator to try to get the computed value, and again, it's going to update the display of our calculator. So now when we click equals, it'll actually call the compute function inside of our code here. So let's work on implementing this now. The first thing we need to do is create a variable, which we're just going to call computation, and this is going to be the result of our compute function. Next, we need to create two more variables. We'll have a previous variable, and this is just going to be the actual number version of our previous operand right here. So we're just converting this string to a number, and we're going to do the exact same thing with current. So here we're going to get our current operand, and then what we want to do is we want to check, because if, for example, the user doesn't actually enter anything and they click equal, we don't want the code to actually run. So we're going to check if it is not a number for previous, so if we don't have a previous value, or if, for example, we don't have a current value, then we just want to return, which will essentially cancel this function completely. Then we're going to use what's called a switch statement. And a switch statement is very much like a bunch of if statements chained after each other, but they allow you to do a bunch of if statements on a single object. So in our case, we want to do a bunch of if statements on this dot operation, and inside of the switch, you define your if statements by the keyword of case. And then we put what this dot operation should equal. So in our case, when we have a plus symbol for this dot operation, we want to execute the code inside of this case. We follow this by a colon here, and all of the code inside of this case will be executed when this dot operation equals a plus. So all we want to do is we want to set that computation variable equal to our previous value added to our current value. And then we need to use the line here of break, which will essentially say not to follow any of the case statements and to just leave the switch statement completely. We want to do this a bunch of times, once for each of our different cases. So let's paste this down a few times here. Make sure we unindent everything, and we're going to have subtraction, which is going to be our previous value minus our current value. We're going to have multiplication, same thing, previous times there. Make sure that's inside the string quotes. And again, we're going to have division. I'm going to just copy this symbol straight from the HTML, paste it in here, and we want this to be previous divided by our current value.
Okay, pause there for you to get caught up. A couple of quick things. Look at line 37. He's using the is nan. What does is nan mean? Did you catch it? He talked about it a little bit. Did you catch what he said? Look at what it's doing. Not a number. Nan means not a number. So if previous or current are not numbers, okay? Also, I'm always conflicted when it comes to switch statements. They're just so darn useful. I feel like I'm taking a shortcut that I shouldn't be taking, but I mean they're just so darn useful, and they look so clean. That's the other thing too, is they just like there's not an endless list of switch statements. Now, so here's my personal recommendation. If you are testing for 3 or less cases, use an if statement. If you're testing for 4 or more, use a switch. You will thank me in the long run. And as you may recall, he'll show this here in a second, but as you may recall, the end of a switch statement is default. Is that the word? I think it's default. So you can do an else as well, essentially, within a switch statement. So let's move along. Oh, also, so we talked about constants. So they're on line 35 and 36. Now hold on a second. Those are constants. I said those weren't going to change, but our previous and current operands are going to change, right? So how does that make sense? How do we justify that? How do we justify that we're changing a constant? Any thoughts? This is kind of philosophical kind of programming theory, but okay, so we're not actually changing it. We are changing the value of it, right? But as far as the code is concerned, previous and current operand never change. They're always the same thing. Their values are different, but it isn't looking at that. It's not concerned with that. It's only focused on, is this concept, this object the same? So this is to say that we're parsing those things into float. We're turning them into floats, into floating point decimal numbers, right? So that operation is always going to remain the same, even if the content, the value of the thing on which it is performing that changes. Okay, so didn't want that to throw anybody.
And along with if statements, we also have the ability to define an else statement, which is defined as a default here. And this default is anytime none of these values get executed, whatever is in the default is going to get executed. And in our case, we just want to return, because if none of these symbols match our operation, then that means we have an invalid operation somehow, so we don't want to do any computation. Now, finally, with our computation done, outside of the switch statement, we can come in here, we can set our current operand, which is just going to be equal to the result of our computation. We can set our operation here equal to undefined, and we can set our previous operand equal to an empty string, just like this. And now, inside of our calculator here, we're actually able to perform calculations. So we can say 1 plus 1 equals, and we're going to get 2 right here. And for example, if we clear this out, oh, actually we can't clear things out, and that's because we haven't implemented the clear function yet. So let's do that real quick now. We can just copy this equals code. Instead of being the equals button, this is just the all clear button. And
I'm pausing here because I want to give you a chance to get caught up on lines 90 through 98 if you missed lines 90 through 93 a moment ago. And it also gives me the opportunity to ask you the question. Beginning on line 83 there with the operation buttons, he's doing a for each loop. But on the next 2 blocks of code there, he's just adding the event lister. He's not running a for each loop. Why is that? He ran a for each loop on these blocks here, but not on these. Any thought what his rationale might be there?
What's the last one going to be? All clear?
All clear button?
Because you only do those 2 once.
Yeah, you don't need, yeah, exactly. You don't need to loop through them. There are multiple number buttons, right? So he's looping through everything that is a number button and adding the event lister and all the other stuff that he has to do. On these down here, there's only one of each of them. There's only one equals button, there's only one all clear button, and here in a minute there will be only one delete button. So he just needs to add the functionality, the event listers and all the other functionality. He doesn't have to loop through anything. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
instead of calling compute, here we want to call clear. Now, if for example we have 1 plus 1, and we click all clear, everything will clear out, which is perfect. Now, what I was trying to demonstrate is we can click 1 plus 1, and then click plus again, and you'll see it computes 2, and if we clicked 1 and equals, we get 3. And that's thanks to the code that we wrote up here, where we checked if the previous operand already existed, and we did the computation before actually doing our operand choosing. The last button to implement here is our delete button, and this is going to be really straightforward to implement. First thing we want to do is we want to change our current operand, and we want to set it equal to our current operand here, current operand, and all we want to do is convert this to a string, and we want to get the very last value from the string and chop it off. And that's what the slice method is for. We want to go from index number 0 all the way to 1 from the end. So essentially this is going to take all of the different characters inside this string, all the different numbers, from the very first number all the way to the second to last number, and it's going to save that in this new current operand variable, essentially chopping off the last one. And if we go down to the very bottom here and hook that variable up, so we can take our delete button, if I spell it properly, and instead of clear, we just want to call delete. Now if we type in long string here, and we want to get rid of one of the characters, we just click delete, and it'll slowly remove one from that every single time. And now at a base value, our calculator is entirely functional, but the actual display of our calculator is not that nice. We don't have any of the commas that we'd like to see, our operand's not showing up here, and so on. So let's go into our calculator and actually change our update display to display things as we would like them to be. The first thing that we want to do is come in here with an if statement, and we want to say that if we have an operation, so if the operation is not equal to null, then in here we want to display our previous operand text element. And we want a combination of both our previous operand here and our operation. So we can just add the operation here, so this dot operation, and now this is going to be a string that has the operation appended to the end of it. If we save that, say 23 plus, you'll see up here it says 23 plus.
Does anybody remember the little $ thing with the curly braces? We talked about that very briefly in C# last semester, very briefly. It's similar to in Python, the format strings, right? Basically what that is saying is anytime you see a $, this is newish to C# but it's existed in JavaScript for a super long time. The $ curly braces means take everything that follows the $ and is within the curly braces and replace it with whatever this piece of code is. So in this case, it's going to be the value of previous operand and the value of the operation, which in this case is 23 plus. Does that make sense? Okay, awesome.
And this is great, but again, we still don't have the actual comma delimited values showing up as we do on this calculator. If we add in a large number, you can see that it nicely delimits these values with commas. So let's work on implementing that now, and we can do that with a helper function. We'll call it getDisplayNumber, and we'll pass it in a number. And this function is just going to return that number, but converted to a display value. For now, we'll just return the number given to it, and we're going to call this function down here. So we'll say this.getDisplayNumber, and we're going to pass it the current operand here, and we're going to do the exact same thing, but we're going to do it for this.previous operand. And now any changes we make in this function are going to be reflected in both the previous and the current operand values. And this function is going to be a little bit complicated. We're going to first make a straightforward version of it, and then I'll show you some of the problems with that. The first thing that we want to do is we want to set this number to an actual float. So we can say here, we'll just create a variable called float number, and we're just going to set that equal to parse float of number. And this is because our number is actually a string, and we want to convert it to a number first. Then we can say that if the float number is not a number, and if that's the case, we can just return an empty string, since we don't actually know how to format this number, since it's not a number. Then if we do have a number, we want to say return the number to locale string, so number dot to locale string, and inside of here we pass a locale, which is essentially a language. In our case, we'll just pass English, and if we save that, go over to our calculator here and type out a long number, you'll notice it's not formatting, and that's because we need to make sure we use our float number down here instead of our normal number. Now if we save that and type this out, you'll see as our number gets longer, it'll automatically place in commas for us. And you may think that that's perfect, but if we clear this, let's say that we wanted to type a decimal place. I can click this as many times as I want, but it's never going to show up here until I select a different number, and that's because when we try to parse that decimal place into a float, it can't be parsed into a float because it's just a decimal place. This also has problems for if we want to add a bunch of zeros after the decimal place, as I click it, you see nothing's actually happening. So now, to get around that problem, what we're going to do is we're going to actually split the number we get given into both the integer part, which is before the decimal place, and the decimal part, which comes after the decimal place. So in order
Okay, so get ready. He goes through this part fairly fast, but if you just type as he types, you should be able to keep up at a somewhat decent pace. Just wanted to forewarn you.
to do that, we're going to first get our string number. So we're going to say string number is going to be equal to number.toString. And we want a string here because we want to be able to split that string on the decimal character inside of it. And we may be getting a number or we may be getting a string here. We're not entirely sure. Next, we want to get the integer numbers. So we'll say integer digits so that we know that this is an actual float. And we're going to set this equal to parse float. And we want to take our string number. We want to split it on the actual period character. So this is going to take our string, turn it into an array. The first number in the array is going to be the part before the period, and the second number is the part after the period. And what we want to do is we want to get that first part because we want the integer values before that. We can do a very similar thing, which is going to be for our decimal digits, but we don't actually want to parse this into a float yet because we don't need it to be a number. Also, we want to get the second portion of that array, which is the numbers after the decimal place. Now let's remove some of this code down here since we no longer need it, and we want to get the integer display separately. So we're going to say integer display, and we're just going to let this be blank for now, and we're going to check to see if our integer digits is going to be not a number. So is not a number, and essentially this will happen anytime someone inputs nothing on the screen or inputs just a decimal place. And if that's the case, we want our integer display to just be equal to an empty string. But if, for example, they did enter an integer value, that's where we want to use that locale string. So we're going to set that integer display equal to our integer digits dot toLocale string, and we want to use English. And another thing that we want to make sure we do is that we don't have any decimal places after this. So we want to say our maximum fraction digits is going to be set equal to 0, which means there can never be any decimal places after this value when it gets converted to a string with a bunch of commas, which is perfect for our use case. Now that we have the integer display being set, let's go down here and we want to check to see if we have any decimal digits. So if our decimal digits is not equal to null, then that means that the user did enter a period and has some numbers after it. And if that is the case, we want to return to them the integer display. So in here we have integer display, and we want to follow that up with a period and all of our decimal digits. So we're just going to say decimal digits here, and if they do not have any decimal digits, we just want to return to them the integer display. Now if we save that and go over to our code here, if we type in, for example, 1, 2, 3, we put a period, you'll see that that period actually shows up right here, which is perfect. And if we put an O or anything afterwards, that's working just fine. Also, if we start with a period, you'll see the period shows up and everything after it will show up just perfectly fine, and even our calculations still work out just like this, as you can see. You will notice though that our previous operand value didn't clear itself. So if we go down to our update display, you'll see that we're never actually clearing this value if the operation does not exist. So we'll just put in a simple else here, and we'll say if this previous operation inner text element here, we're going to set this equal to an empty string. And now if we save that and we do a calculation, just a simple one, click equal, it'll empty out that previous operand value for us and leave us only with our current operand value, which is perfect. And with that, we have a completely functioning modern JavaScript calculator working in the browser. If you enjoyed this video,
Okay, so like I said, long video, but we stopped a couple of times to let everybody get at least a little bit caught up and to discuss some concepts and topics and things like that. Word of advice to you: if you are currently in mobile app, or if you will be in mobile app in the fall, no, in the spring, I highly, highly, highly recommend that you do not get rid of anything you make for this class. Just a piece of advice for you. I probably wouldn't get rid of anything. I wouldn't get rid of anything you make in any of my classes ever personally, at least until you finish your degree, just because you never know when I might call on them again. or when you might want them for your resume or your portfolio in the future. Okay, so what we ended up with here is that we have a functional calculator, right? So what I'm going to want you to do when you come back from break is I'm going to want you to finish it up or start it if you didn't follow along. Totally fine if you want to just watch the video. I don't judge you at all. So I go back and forth. Sometimes I want to do while I'm watching. Sometimes I want to watch and then do while I watch it a second time or whatever. But I'm going to want you to change the background color, right? Because he did that gradient, right? And maybe change the color of the buttons. Maybe go on. Let me see if let me show you. Let's see. We talked about this in mobile app. No. I'm sorry. We talked about this in software engineering project last Friday. What?
Colors and all of that.
Oh, yes. So this is Dafont, dafont.com. You can see it up there in the upper left-hand corner, dafont.com. There are a billion awesome fonts on here. I wanted to really quickly show you, if you click on LCD, see it's got like some calculator-esque fonts. You can also click on more options here and do public domain and 100% free. That way you don't have to worry about like a font that's gonna like, it's like trialware or that like, you know, donationware, but oh, I feel bad because I'm not donating or whatever. These are either public domain fonts or 100% like licensed free fonts. I always do that. Like, for example, this linear beam is a font that I use all the time for things because it's a really cool like old dot matrix kind of style font. Well, actually, I guess this is a dot matrix font, but this is more of like an old those like jet printers, right? Side-to-side jet printers. Anyway, I like to make sure that I'm never going to like get in trouble for using someone's font. Also, and I don't mean this in like a penny pinching sense, but like if I were to make something, I don't have to pay royalties to somebody to like use their font or something because like that just gets really complicated and difficult. It's just a lot easier if you just use something you don't have to pay royalties on. That way you don't even have to worry about it. Like, you know, it's not that I want all the money, it's that I want to not have to deal with the headaches of having to like, oh, make sure this person got their money for this thing and like all the, you know, kind of stuff. That's why I'm such a proponent of like public domain and free stuff because it's way less headaches on you, the developer, if you aren't having to deal with that kind of legalese nonsense. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of cool ones that you could use here if you wanted to, or you could do something like this, Old London, right? Do something fancy if you want to do that. You can also real quick, let me show you the one we. Ooh, that's not what I meant to do. Okay. Now this one, there are free and pro subscriptions, if you will. This is more stuff like these sorts of things, right? These aren't fonts in the traditional sense. These are more things like I said, like symbols and that sort of stuff. I mentioned in this class at one point, like if you want the Facebook logo to do stuff, this is where you get it. Would be font awesome. So I just wanted to show you that one as well, so that everybody was familiar with where to get that sort of stuff. Are there any questions, concerns, comments, thoughts, ideas? No? All right, come back at 10:15 and we will start working on our project.